The black woman saved Big Shaq's life in the freezing mountains. No cameras, no backup, just instinct and courage. But by morning, instead of a thank you, the black woman loses her job. Then the sky breaks open. 2 helicopters land at the black woman's home, and what steps out changes everything. This isn't just about rescue, it's about reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Diana Santos had always found solace in the mountains. The towering pines and winding trails of the Appalachians offered her a sanctuary from the relentless noise of the city and the quiet weight of expectations that clung to her skin like an invisible burden. It was her rare day off, a break from the long, grueling shifts at the hospital, where she gave everything of herself and often received so little in return. With each step along the uneven path, the tension in her shoulders eased, her breath deepened, and the world seemed to slow to a gentler, more manageable pace. She had chosen an unfamiliar trail that morning, a decision sparked by an impulse to lose herself in new surroundings, to let the fresh air and towering trees cleanse her of recent frustrations. The trail was quiet, but not silent. Birds chirped high above, leaves rustled with the breeze, and the distant sound of a stream echoed softly in the hollow. She moved with the steady gait of someone used to long hours on her feet, her pack light, her steps sure. It was in the middle of this calm that the tranquility shattered. A sharp sound, a groan, a crash of movement through the underbrush, rippled through the air. Diana froze, her instincts sharpening. She scanned the landscape, her pulse quickening. There, just beyond a copse of trees, a large figure lay sprawled on the ground. Her heart jumped, caution warred with compassion, but her training surged forward. She moved closer, eyes narrowing against the dappled light filtering through the canopy. The man was massive, his body twisted awkwardly, a smear of blood darkening the side of his head. His chest rose and fell shallowly, breath ragged and uneven. His clothes, though high quality, were torn and streaked with dirt and pine needles. Diana knelt beside him, her fingers brushing his wrist to check for a pulse. It fluttered beneath her fingertips, weak but present. No phone, no ID, no way to call for help in the middle of nowhere. Panic threatened to bubble up, but she stamped it down. She focused instead on the immediate steps. Stabilize, protect the airway, control bleeding. Improvised solutions formed in her mind. Using a scarf from her pack, she fashioned a makeshift bandage for his head wound. She rolled him gently onto his side, ensuring he wouldn't choke if he vomited. His breathing remained shallow, but steady. The man stirred slightly, a groan escaping his lips, his face contorting in pain. His eyes opened briefly, dark and unfocused. For a fleeting moment, their gazes met, and she saw a flicker of confusion and fear. Then his eyes rolled back, and he slipped into unconsciousness again. The sun hung lower now, shadows stretching across the forest floor. Diana knew she couldn't leave him here. She scanned the area, searching for any sign of other hikers, but the trail was empty. She'd chosen this path for its seclusion, a choice that now complicated everything. Gathering her strength, she hooked her arms beneath his and tried to shift his weight. He was impossibly heavy, and her muscles trembled with the effort. Still, inch by inch she managed to drag him toward a flatter area closer to the trail. As she worked, her mind raced. Who was he? What had brought him here, alone and injured? His size and build suggested an athlete, someone used to physical exertion. The expensive but practical gear hinted at wealth, but wealth alone didn't explain his presence, nor his collapse. By the time she had him settled, sweat soaked her shirt, and her breath came in sharp, shallow gulps. She sat back, wiping her brow, her pulse still racing. She needed help, but her phone had no signal here. The nearest ranger station was miles away, and night was approaching. The idea of leaving him alone in the gathering darkness gnawed at her, but there was no choice. As she prepared to set off down the trail for help, a faint rustle behind her froze her in place. She turned, half expecting a bear or a curious animal, but it was a couple hikers coming from the opposite direction. Relief flooded through her. She called out, waving her arms, drawing them over. They were cautious at first, hesitant to approach the unconscious man. One of them, a middle-aged man with wary eyes, muttered something under his breath that made Diana's stomach twist, something about how people like him shouldn't be out here. The implication stung, but she bit her tongue. Together they fashioned a rough stretcher from branches, and a tarp from her pack, lifting the injured man with as much care as they could manage. The process was slow, fraught with the risk of further injury, but they finally managed to carry him down the trail toward the nearest access point. At the trailhead, an ambulance had arrived. Alerted by the hikers who'd had a working signal, paramedics took over, loading the man into the back of the vehicle. One of them shot Diana a look, a mix of admiration and disapproval. "You should have waited," he said quietly. "Policy says we're supposed to check ID, insurance, call it in, can't just start treatment without clearance." Diana's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. She knew the unspoken rules, the bureaucracy that often came before compassion. But she also knew she couldn't have stood by and done nothing. She watched as the ambulance doors closed, taking the man still a stranger to the hospital. As the vehicle pulled away, Diana stood in the fading light, a knot of unease twisting in her gut. She had done everything right, everything human and instinctive. Yet something about the way the paramedic looked at her, about the muttered comments on the trail, made her stomach churn. The man she'd saved wasn't just anyone. There was something larger at play, something she couldn't quite see but could feel hovering at the edge of her awareness. She turned to leave, her steps heavy on the gravel, her mind already racing ahead to the hospital, to the questions that would surely follow. She didn't know yet that the man she had saved was Shaquille O'Neal. She didn't know that by morning, her world would be upended. But as the mountains swallowed her silhouette, as the shadows deepened, and as the echo of the man's shallow breaths lingered in her ears, Diana Santos knew one thing for certain: she had done the right thing, even if the world would soon punish her for it. The next morning, Diana arrived at the hospital, her mind still weighted by the events of the previous day. She hadn't slept much, her thoughts returning again and again to the man she had rescued from the mountains. The image of his injured form, the shallow rise and fall of his chest, clung to her memory like an echo of something she couldn't shake. Still, there was comfort in knowing she had done the right thing. That certainty stayed with her as she walked through the sterile, humming corridors of the hospital. But by midday, the air around her shifted. A subtle change that she couldn't quite define. Colleagues who usually offered friendly greetings averted their eyes or nodded stiffly as she passed. Whispered conversations seemed to hush whenever she drew near. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Hospitals were busy. Lives moved fast, and rumors flowed like an undercurrent beneath the surface. But when her supervisor, a tall, tight-lipped man named Carlson, summoned her to his office, the unease that had been simmering beneath her skin surged to the surface. The office was stark, the blinds drawn against the harsh sunlight outside. Carlson didn't offer a seat. Instead, he remained standing, arms folded across his chest, a thin folder resting on the desk between them. Diana's pulse quickened as he cleared his throat. "Diana, we need to discuss yesterday's incident," he said, his voice flat, almost mechanical. Her mind raced, searching for what he might mean. "If this is about the man I helped on the mountain, I can explain." Carlson raised a hand to silence her. "The policy is clear," he interrupted. "You administered medical care without verifying identification or insurance. You took matters into your own hands, outside the chain of command. This kind of behavior puts the hospital at legal and financial risk. Effective immediately, your employment is terminated." The words struck her like a slap, leaving her breathless. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came. The injustice of it roared in her ears, louder than the cold, detached tone of his voice. She had saved a life. There had been no time for protocol or paperwork, but none of that mattered here. In a daze, she left the office, her steps wooden as she walked down the hallway, past faces that now felt unfamiliar and distant. Her badge, her access to the only world she had known, was revoked with a few strokes of a pen. The walls of the hospital, once a place of healing, now felt suffocating, oppressive. By the time she reached the exit, her mind was spinning. It wasn't just the firing, it was the suddenness of it, the clinical way it was done, the implication that she had acted recklessly when she had simply done what any decent human being would do. And beneath it all, the unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. She was being punished for more than just breaking a rule. She was a woman of color who had dared to act decisively, compassionately, without waiting for permission. As she stepped outside, the bright sunlight made her squint, but it did nothing to lift the heaviness in her chest. She stood there for a long moment, her mind replaying every step of the past 24 hours. It was then that she noticed a man leaning against a nearby pillar, half hidden in the shadow. He was dressed in a rumpled suit, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave her a subtle nod before turning and disappearing into the parking lot. A chill ran down her spine. There was something in that man's demeanor that hinted at knowledge, as if he had been waiting for this moment. The unease she had felt earlier now sharpened into a point of suspicion. She realized with a sudden clarity that her termination hadn't been a spontaneous decision. Someone had been pulling strings, orchestrating her fall from behind closed doors. That night, as she sat in her small apartment, her termination papers spread across the kitchen table, she sifted through every interaction from the past few weeks. A pattern began to emerge, subtle questions about her work habits, her adherence to protocol, her interactions with certain patients, whispers of discontent that in hindsight seemed too coordinated to be coincidence. She was beginning to see the edges of a larger picture, one where her compassion and skill had threatened the careful balance of corruption and greed that thrived in the hospital's upper ranks. She had stumbled upon something they wanted buried, and they had used her own dedication against her. In the quiet darkness of her apartment, she realized her termination wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a far more dangerous and complicated battle. There were forces at work, unseen hands moving behind the scenes, determined to silence anyone who stood in their way. But as the weight of that realization settled over her, a spark of resolve ignited in her chest. She wouldn't be silenced. Not now, not when the truth demanded to be seen. Shaq's body healed faster than anyone expected. The bruises faded, the stitches came out, and his breathing steadied with each passing day. The medical staff whispered in awe at his resilience, but none of them knew the quiet, unspoken truth that his recovery wasn't just a physical triumph but a mental one. Lying in that hospital bed, far from the courts and cameras, he had been forced to confront shadows from his past that he had long kept hidden. Memories of growing up in the South, of his mother Lucille's battles against quiet discrimination, were surfaced with sharp clarity. He remembered the doors slammed in her face, the murmured comments, the helplessness in her eyes that she'd tried to shield from her son. Those ghosts now whispered at the edges of his consciousness as he scrolled through news feeds and social media, piecing together fragments of a story he hadn't yet publicly owned. Meanwhile, Diana's world spiraled. Rumors about her actions had begun to circulate, each retelling distorting the truth a little more. Some painted her as reckless, an impulsive nurse who had endangered a patient. Others suggested she had violated protocols for personal gain, perhaps seeking recognition or a promotion. The whispers gnawed at her reputation, erasing the simple, undeniable truth. She had saved a life. In the sterile world of rules and regulations, compassion had no weight against the cold calculus of policy. It was on a humid evening, heavy with the threat of rain, that the knock came at Diana's door. She hesitated before opening it, half expecting a neighbor or perhaps someone from the hospital with more paperwork to deliver. But instead, a tall man in a crisp gray suit stood there, his expression calm but unreadable. His voice was low, professional. "Miss Santos, I'm here on behalf of Mr. O'Neal. May I come in?" Diana's pulse quickened, but she stepped aside to let him enter. The assistant, he introduced himself as Marcus, glanced around her modest apartment, taking in the stack of unopened mail on the counter, and the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. "Mr. O'Neal wants you to know how deeply he appreciates what you did," Marcus said, his voice measured. "He's aware of your situation and he's troubled by it." Diana folded her arms, unsure of what to say. "I didn't do it for gratitude," she said quietly. "I know," Marcus replied, his tone softening. "That's exactly why he wanted to send me. He's not ready to step forward publicly yet, but he wanted you to know he's watching. He's trying to figure out how best to help without making things worse." The words hung in the air, weighted with unspoken complexities. Diana felt a rush of conflicting emotions: gratitude, frustration, suspicion. She had expected the man she had saved to step into the light, to use his influence to clear her name. But instead she found herself caught in a liminal space, her actions acknowledged, but her future still uncertain. As Marcus handed her a plain white envelope, she sensed the layers beneath the gesture. "This isn't hush money," he said quickly, almost as if reading her thoughts. "It's support, a way to help you get through this, until Mr. O'Neal can decide on a more permanent solution. He's struggling with how to navigate this, delicately." After Marcus left, Diana sat alone at her kitchen table, the envelope untouched before her. She could feel the walls of her apartment closing in, the weight of expectation pressing down on her. Outside, rain began to fall, drumming against the windows. She thought about Shaq, imagined him in some high-rise apartment, surrounded by advisors and lawyers, trying to decide how much of himself to reveal to the world. She imagined his struggle, the balancing act between his public image and the quiet pull of justice, the childhood memories that must be clawing at him now, pushing him to act. She wondered if he saw in her situation an echo of his own mother's battles, if he heard in her story the same notes of quiet defiance and relentless dignity that Lucille had embodied. And yet she also sensed his hesitation. Shaq's world was built on appearances, on contracts and endorsements, on a delicate network of alliances that could crumble if he took a stand. His silence wasn't indifference, it was fear. Not for himself but for the people who depended on him, the empire he had built, and the reputation he had cultivated. But Diana wasn't a figure in his private history. She was standing in the storm's eye, her life unraveling while the world speculated and whispered. And even as she felt sympathy for Shaq's struggle, she couldn't help but feel the sting of betrayal. His gratitude, however genuine, couldn't shield her from the consequences she now faced. As she lay awake that night, listening to the rain, she felt a knot of resolve forming deep within her. She would not wait for Shaq or anyone else to decide her fate. If he chose to stand with her, she would be grateful, but if not, she would stand alone, and she would stand tall. Somewhere beneath the surface, she sensed larger forces stirring, forces that neither she nor Shaq had yet fully grasped. There was more at stake here than a single act of compassion. There was a story of power, of systems designed to crush the human spirit, and of quiet, relentless courage. The early light was just beginning to spill over the rooftops, painting the modest neighborhood in a soft, pale glow. She had barely begun to gather her thoughts from the sleepless night when the first distant thrum of rotors reached her ears. At first it was faint, an indistinct hum like a heavy breeze pushing through the trees. But as the sound grew louder, a ripple of anxiety passed through her. Stepping onto her porch, she shielded her eyes from the rising sun and scanned the sky. There, just above the treetops, two dark shapes emerged, growing larger with each passing second. Neighbors, still in their pajamas or clutching steaming mugs of coffee, drifted into their yards, craning their necks toward the sky. Whispers buzzed among them, speculation rising like smoke. Some muttered about federal agents, others wondered aloud if there had been a major crime or disaster. The air was thick with apprehension, punctuated only by the growing roar of the descending helicopters. When the sleek black machines finally touched down on the street outside Diana's home, the force of their landing sent ripples through the air, flattening grass and causing curtains to flutter in nearby windows. The rotors slowed, their rhythmic chopping replaced by the distant echo of approaching footsteps. Doors on the helicopters opened, and from within a flurry of movement erupted, suits, cameras, and equipment spilling out in practiced precision. Diana's breath caught as a figure stepped into view. It was unmistakably Shaquille O'Neal, dressed not in his usual tailored public persona but in a simple dark jacket and jeans. The contrast was jarring against the sharp suits and polished shoes of the legal team and media professionals surrounding him. He moved with a quiet determination, his towering frame commanding attention without words. Shaq's presence triggered a shift in the atmosphere. Neighbors who had been murmuring fearfully now whispered in awe. Cameras were raised, microphones thrust forward. News vans began to converge on the street, drawn by the spectacle. Reporters called out questions, their voices a chaotic blend of curiosity and confusion. For a moment Diana felt paralyzed. The man whose life she had saved, the man who had remained a silent, shadowy figure until now, stood before her not as a patient or a symbol, but as a living, breathing force determined to change the narrative. He approached her with a calm but purposeful stride, his eyes locking onto hers, silently communicating a gratitude and determination deeper than words could convey. Shaq turned to face the gathering crowd, his voice steady as he addressed them. "This woman saved my life," he began, his words cutting through the noise. "She didn't ask for my name or my status. She didn't hesitate because of protocols or paperwork. She saw a person in need, and acted, and now, she's being punished for it." His voice resonated with authority and quiet rage, his words carrying across the street like a challenge. The media seized on his statement. Cameras flashing, reporters scrambling to capture every detail. But beneath the surface of this orchestrated spectacle, Diana sensed the threads of danger tightening. As the media frenzy intensified, so did the arrival of unwelcome faces, suits and officials who tried to blend into the background, their eyes scanning the scene with clinical detachment, Diana recognized some of them from the hospital board meetings she had attended as a nurse. There was no mistaking their unease, their barely concealed frustration at the attention Shaq was drawing to a story they would have preferred to bury. Whispers of corruption, of insurance fraud and systemic discrimination, began to surface as reporters dug deeper. Shaq's legal team distributed documents and statements, each one painting a clearer picture of the institutional failures that had led to Diana's termination. The evidence was damning, the impact immediate. Public opinion swung like a pendulum, the community rallying behind Diana even as anonymous threats began to trickle in. Emails, phone calls, and subtle warnings that she should back down before it's too late. Despite the swelling tide of support, a chill settled over Diana's heart. She knew this wasn't just about one nurse's firing, or even about Shaq's injury. It was about power, who held it, who enforced it, and who was willing to break the silence. Shaq's public stand, though brave, had painted a target not just on her but on anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. Still, as the helicopters idled in the background casting long shadows across the street, Diana felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't a fight she would have chosen, but it was one she would see through. And for the first time, she wasn't standing alone. As Shaq placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, the cameras captured the moment, and the image would soon ripple across screens and headlines nationwide, a symbol of resilience, courage, and the quiet rebellion of integrity. But even as the scene unfolded with the choreography of a public relations campaign, Diana couldn't shake the sense that this was only the beginning. The real battle, the one that would test her resolve and the limits of her endurance, was just beginning to stir in the shadows beyond the media's glare. Shaq's decision to stand beside her sent ripples through the hospital's administrative hierarchy. Board meetings were hastily convened behind closed doors, legal teams scrambled to draft statements designed to deflect blame, and hushed conversations passed along the hospital's corridors. What had once been whispered suspicions about racial bias and unethical practices now swelled into full-throated accusations. The hospital's public relations machine kicked into overdrive, but it was clear that the usual platitudes and corporate apologies wouldn't contain this firestorm. Diana felt the change not just in the stories that dominated the evening news, but in the community around her. Neighbors who had once kept their distance now approached her with quiet words of support. Patients she had cared for over the years sent letters, recounting their own experiences with the system's indifference. The local church organized a vigil outside the hospital, candles flickering like fragile symbols of defiance against an institution built on silence and profit. It was in the middle of this gathering storm that the first anonymous envelope arrived at Diana's door. It was slipped under her door one evening, a thick packet of documents bound by a simple black string. The papers inside were stark and damning: internal memos, patient records, and coded communications that painted a chilling picture of systemic racial profiling and profit-driven malpractice. Patients were routinely categorized by race, insurance status, and profitability, their care dictated not by medical need, but by spreadsheets and risk assessments. Diana's stomach churned as she read through the reports, the lines between negligence and calculated cruelty blurring with every page. At the heart of the documents was a name Diana recognized, a senior hospital executive known for his polished public image and relentless focus on the bottom line. His signature adorned many of the memos, his directives chilling in their precision. It was clear that her termination had been more than a bureaucratic response. It was part of a calculated effort to silence dissent, to protect a system that profited from inequality and desperation. Diana shared the contents with Shaq, meeting him in a quiet corner of a local diner late one evening. He listened intently, his large hands folded on the table, his expression darkening with each revelation. She could see the tension in his jaw, the weight of responsibility settling heavier on his shoulders. For all his public persona of confidence and charisma, there was a deep current of anger and sorrow beneath the surface. He spoke softly, recounting memories of his mother's struggles, of the barriers she had faced, of the quiet dignity with which she had fought to protect him and their family. The realization that he now stood on the cusp of confronting a similar battle gnawed at him, stirring a determination that went beyond personal loyalty. As they plotted their next steps, a plan began to form, not one born of revenge, but of justice. Shaq would use his influence to bring the documents to light, but he would not stand alone. They would build a coalition of voices: patients, former employees, community leaders, who had long borne the weight of the system's failures. Diana, once a quiet figure in the background, found herself reluctantly stepping into a role she had never sought, a symbol of integrity, a rallying point for those who had been silenced. The media's narrative began to shift. driven by leaks of key information from the anonymous whistleblower. News outlets published stories exposing the hospital's practices, juxtaposing glowing corporate statements with stark evidence of discrimination and greed. The hospital's leadership issued panic denials, but their words rang hollow against the mounting tide of testimony and documentation. Yet, with each public victory, the undercurrents of danger grew stronger. Diana received veiled warnings. Anonymous messages slipped into her mailbox, threatening phone calls at odd hours, cars parked too long outside her home. Shaq's legal team hired security, discreet but ever-present, to watch over her. The community's support remained steadfast, but shadows of intimidation stretched longer with each passing day. Through it all, Diana's resolve only deepened. She spent long hours poring over the documents, cross-referencing details, building a timeline of deceit that stretched back years. With the help of Shaq's team, she uncovered patterns of discrimination that reached beyond her hospital, suggesting a network of similar practices in other institutions. The realization was both chilling and galvanizing. This was no isolated incident. It was a system that thrived on invisibility and the calculated dehumanization of the vulnerable. As they prepared to go public with their findings, Diana and Shaq found allies in unexpected places. A retired physician stepped forward with his own story of being pressured to alter patient records. A former billing clerk provided copies of financial reports that showed clear patterns of overcharging minority patients. Each new voice added weight to their case, each testimony a crack in the armor of silence that had protected the hospital's leadership for so long. The anonymous whistleblower remained in the shadows, their identity a mystery, but their actions had set something in motion that could not be stopped. Diana often found herself wondering about their motivations. What had driven them to risk everything to expose the truth? There was something almost poetic in the way their secrecy mirrored her own quiet beginnings. Both of them ordinary people drawn into a battle neither had chosen but neither could abandon. As the first legal filings were prepared, and the media buzzed with anticipation, Diana stood at the center of it all. Her life forever changed. The quiet nurse who had once hiked alone in the mountains was now a force that even the most entrenched powers could no longer ignore. The seeds of resistance had been planted, and though the path ahead remained fraught with danger and uncertainty, one truth was now undeniable. The silence had been broken, and the fight for justice had only just begun. Diana sat at her kitchen table late into the night. The stack of documents splayed before her like a map of betrayal. The whistleblower's evidence was detailed, ruthless in its clarity. Every line exposed a new depth of corruption, each chart and memo revealing systemic malice dressed up in corporate language. As she read, the house felt colder, the walls closer. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, a subtle warning echoing in the silence. Her thoughts looped relentlessly, circling the same question: how far would they go to keep this buried? The air felt heavier these days, the sunlight filtering through her windows more muted, as if the weight of secrets had dimmed even the natural world. There were moments she thought she caught the flicker of movement beyond her blinds, or glimpsed a familiar figure on the street. More than once, her phone buzzed with an untraceable number. Sometimes there was no voice on the line, only the faint sound of breathing. Other times it was silence, so deep it seemed to swallow her own breath. Shaq's legal team had insisted on adding layers of protection. Discreet but vigilant security monitored her house from a distance, and her phone was checked for spyware. She appreciated the efforts, but it was clear even they couldn't control every shadow, every whispered threat. There were too many vested interests, too many people with too much to lose. She felt like she was walking a tightrope strung between two towering walls. On one side was the promise of truth, and on the other the abyss of silence. Every step she took risked tipping her into darkness. The stress seeped into her bones, but it also sparked a resolve she hadn't known she possessed. She began organizing the documents methodically, creating timelines, annotating connections, building a case that was solid, undeniable. She worked with Shaq's team, each late-night call a lifeline of focus and determination. Through those calls, she glimpsed Shaq's own unease. He was a man accustomed to commanding attention, but this battle was unlike any he had fought. The stakes were not measured in points on a scoreboard, but in lives disrupted, injustice denied. His fame brought visibility, but it also painted a target, and Diana could sense his growing awareness of the precariousness of their alliance. It was during one of those restless nights, her mind teetering between exhaustion and determination, that Diana made a decision. She would reach out to her family, a connection she had long neglected. The idea felt both necessary and dangerous. a thread she needed to tug to remember who she was before all this. She hadn't spoken to her sister Mia in years, not since their last bitter argument over family obligations and unspoken expectations. Yet the thought of facing this storm without any anchor felt unbearable. Mia answered on the second ring, her voice cautious, tinged with the weight of old wounds. The conversation was stilted at first, a hesitant dance around the past. But as Diana's words stumbled out, the documents, the threats, the risk, Mia's tone shifted. She spoke of their mother, a woman who had faced her own quiet battles with discrimination and hardship, who had taught them the strength of quiet resistance. Their mother had never sought recognition. She had simply done what was right, even when it cost her comfort and safety. The memory of her steadied Diana's resolve, weaving a thread of generational defiance into her own struggle. Reconnecting with Mia didn't erase the fear, but it gave it shape. It reminded Diana that she was part of something larger than herself, a lineage of women who had faced down injustice with resilience and dignity. It also revealed a crack in her defenses, the realization that no matter how careful she was, she couldn't shield everyone. She couldn't control who might get caught in the crossfire if the system struck back. The paranoia intensified with each passing day. Subtle changes in routine became ominous signs. A car parked too long on her street, a neighbor who suddenly stopped speaking to her, a shadow in the corner of her eye that vanished when she turned. Even inside the hospital, where she still visited to support patients and allies, the air was thick with whispers. Colleagues averted their gaze. Conversations halted when she entered a room, and administrators found reasons to reschedule meetings. The same halls she had once walked with purpose now felt like corridors of suspicion. Despite Shaq's growing public support, Diana sensed that his name alone couldn't shield them both. His fame drew attention, but it also made them more vulnerable. She heard rumors of backroom deals, of veiled offers to quiet the scandal if she withdrew her claims. The pressure mounted from both sides, powerful figures whispering threats, and well-meaning allies cautioning her to be careful, to think of her future. But Diana had already made her choice. She wouldn't be silenced. Each layer of tension, each hint of retaliation, only sharpened her determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself or even for Shaq. She was fighting for every patient who had been reduced to a data point, for every nurse pressured to compromise ethics for the bottom line, for every family forced to navigate a system designed to fail them. In those long, quiet nights, as she mapped out connections and prepared for the coming confrontation, Diana realized something profound. The whispers in the halls weren't just threats. They were the sounds of a crumbling facade, of a system desperate to maintain control. And beneath those whispers, a louder truth was beginning to rise, carried by those willing to stand with her, amplified by Shaq's reluctant but growing commitment to justice. The halls were no longer just corridors of fear. They were the paths through which resistance would flow, quiet at first, but building into something too powerful to silence. The courthouse stood like a monolith against the overcast sky, its steps crowded with reporters, protesters, and curious onlookers. Cameras jostled for position, microphones extended on trembling hands, and the air hummed with a mixture of anticipation and tension. Diana climbed those steps, each morning of the trial, with a weight on her shoulders heavier than any she had borne before. Her face, once anonymous, was now splashed across television screens and news feeds. Her story framed as both a symbol of quiet heroism and a focal point for simmering societal divides. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was equally charged. The hospital's legal team, polished, relentless, armed with stacks of paperwork and a chorus of objections, fought tooth and nail to dismantle the narrative Diana and her allies had built. They picked at technicalities, challenged evidence, and sought to discredit witnesses, all while painting Diana's actions as reckless and unprofessional. Their strategy was clear. If they couldn't erase the truth, they would muddy it until no one could tell fact from fabrication. Diana sat through each session with a quiet, controlled determination. Her fingers clenched tightly beneath the table, her jaw set against the rising tide of anxiety. She had braced herself for the attacks on her character, for the insinuations about her motives, but nothing prepared her for the quiet, unexpected betrayal that surfaced midway through the proceedings. It was during a routine cross-examination, when the name of her colleague, Lila Torres, surfaced. Lila, who had stood by Diana through the first turbulent days, offering comfort and solidarity, had been feeding confidential information to the hospital's legal team. Diana felt the betrayal pierce her like a shard of ice, the realization rippling through her in a way that left her momentarily breathless. Lila's testimony was polished, her manner calm and persuasive, but the subtle glances she cast toward the hospital lawyers were unmistakable. The betrayal cut deeper than the legal maneuvering or the media spin. It was personal, a rupture in the fragile web of trust Diana had relied upon. Her mind raced through past conversations, moments when she had confided her fears and strategies to Lila, never suspecting that those words would be twisted and used against her. The courtroom, already tense, felt colder, the walls closing in as Diana struggled to contain her rising frustration and hurt. Outside, the storm clouds thickened. The media painted Diana as both a hero and a liability, a figure alternately lauded for her courage and scrutinized for supposed recklessness. Shaq's public involvement drew admiration and criticism alike, with commentators questioning his motives and the sincerity of his support. Through it all, Diana maintained her composure, even as the whispers grew louder and the pressure mounted. It was on the day the defense moved to dismiss the case, citing procedural flaws and lack of clear evidence, that Shaq stepped forward. He stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by cameras and flashing lights, his imposing figure framed against the looming gray sky. His voice, steady and rich with emotion, cut through the noise, commanding attention in a way no legal argument could. "I stand here not as an NBA legend, not as a celebrity," he began, his voice carrying across the plaza. "I stand here as a son. My mother, Lucille O'Neal, faced a system that dismissed her, that tried to silence her. She taught me that silence is complicity, that justice isn't given, it's fought for. Diana Santos is fighting not just for herself, but for every person who has been ignored, overlooked, or wronged by a system that values profit over people." The crowd, silent and attentive, seemed to hold its collective breath. Shaq's words resonated, a powerful counterpoint to the dry legal jargon of the courtroom. His sincerity was palpable, the raw edges of his personal history laid bare for all to see. He spoke of his mother's struggles, of her quiet resilience, of the lessons she had instilled in him that now guided his actions. Tears welled in the eyes of many in the crowd, some reporters lowering their cameras as if momentarily ashamed of the spectacle. Diana, listening from the courthouse steps, felt a surge of emotion rise in her chest. Shaq's words were not a shield, not a distraction. They were a beacon, a reminder that this fight was larger than any one person, that the truth had power even when the world tried to drown it in noise. The hospital's legal team scrambled to respond, their polished statements and legal maneuvers faltering in the face of such raw authenticity. The tide of public opinion, already shifting, now surged in Diana's favor, bolstered by the weight of Shaq's speech and the collective outrage of a community tired of injustice. But even as the momentum turned, the shadows lengthened. Diana knew that the verdict was still uncertain, that the hospital's lawyers were already crafting new angles of attack, leveraging connections and influence to tip the scales. The betrayal by Lila lingered in her mind, a reminder that not all battles were fought in the open, and that trust was as fragile as glass. That night, as she prepared for the next day's proceedings, Diana sat by her window, watching the city's lights flicker against the dark sky. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil within, a churning blend of hope and dread. But in the quiet between the flashes of lightning and the distant rumble of thunder, she felt a thread of determination tighten in her chest. No matter the outcome, she would face the storm head-on, her resolve tempered by betrayal, strengthened by solidarity, and guided by the memory of every quiet act of resistance that had brought her to this moment. Inside, the jury foreman's voice rang clear, the words piercing the thick silence like a blade. In favor of the plaintiff, Diana Santos. A murmur rippled through the courtroom, a wave of emotion breaking against the walls. Diana sat motionless for a heartbeat, her pulse thudding in her ears, before the meaning of those words settled over her like a bittersweet shroud. She had won. The hospital had been found liable for wrongful termination and systemic discrimination. Yet even as her supporters erupted in quiet celebration, a sharp edge of melancholy clung to her victory. The hospital's legal team moved quickly, their faces set in expressions of controlled disappointment, already preparing to spin the outcome in their favor. They issued statements filled with carefully crafted language, promising reforms, touting commitments to equity and inclusion. But Diana knew better than to believe hollow words. She had seen the machinery of the system up close, had felt its grinding gears press against her until she nearly disappeared. This verdict, though monumental, was not the end of the fight. Outside, under the relentless gaze of cameras and flashing lights, Shaq stood beside her. His hand rested lightly on her shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity that carried more weight than any speech. He spoke briefly, his voice steady but tinged with the exhaustion of a man who had waded into battle and emerged changed. He promised accountability, transparency, and a commitment to transforming not just one hospital but the very fabric of healthcare. His words resonated, but Diana could sense his deeper resolve, a determination that went beyond public declarations. In the weeks that followed, the hospital's reputation unraveled. Protests gathered outside its entrances, patients and community members demanding not just apologies, but systemic overhaul. Diana and Shaq, unwilling to let the verdict stand as a solitary triumph, spearheaded a new initiative. Together they established a non-profit organization aimed at dismantling the barriers that had long plagued the system. Their vision was ambitious, to transform the very hospital that had wronged Diana into a model of universal care, a place where compassion trumped profit, where every patient received dignified, equitable treatment. The transition was not smooth. There were resistance and obstacles at every turn, administrative roadblocks, financial entanglements, and the lingering grip of those who had once thrived in the shadows of corruption. But Diana, fueled by a mixture of righteous indignation and unwavering hope, refused to yield. With Shaq's influence and resources backing the endeavor, they recruited a team of like-minded professionals, doctors, nurses, administrators, and community leaders, who shared their vision of a healthcare system built on integrity and empathy. The hospital's transformation became a beacon of hope, not just for the local community but for the nation. Stories of patients finally receiving care without fear of discrimination began to surface. Former employees, once silenced by fear of retaliation, stepped forward to share their truths. The once sterile halls now echoed with laughter and renewed purpose, a testament to the power of collective resilience. As the media celebrated the hospital's rebirth, a final twist emerged from the shadows. The identity of the anonymous whistleblower was revealed, not through a public statement, but through a quiet, handwritten letter delivered to Diana's doorstep. The letter was simple, unadorned, yet it carried the weight of confession and redemption. The whistleblower was the child of a senior hospital executive, someone who had grown up surrounded by the sterile, privileged world of boardrooms and legal jargon. They had witnessed the corruption firsthand, had seen the quiet suffering of patients whose names were reduced to entries in a ledger. Moved by Diana's quiet defiance and integrity, the whistleblower had risked everything to expose the truth. They wrote of watching Diana's courage unfold in real time, of feeling complicit in their family's legacy of greed, and of the moment they decided to break the silence. The letter ended with a promise to continue the fight from within, to ensure that the hospital's transformation was more than a cosmetic change. It was a rare, genuine gesture, a thread connecting the past to the present, a reminder that even those complicit in corruption could find redemption. Diana sat with the letter in her hands, the weight of the words settling over her like a balm and a burden. It was a victory tinged with loss, a triumph shadowed by the cost of integrity. She thought of the patients she had cared for, the families she had comforted, the colleagues who had stood by her and those who had faltered. She thought of Shaq, his quiet strength anchoring her through the storm, and of her own journey from an anonymous nurse to a symbol of resilience and hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hospital in a golden glow, Diana felt a sense of cautious optimism. The fight was far from over, but they had ignited something larger than themselves. The hospital's transformation was not just a victory for her, or even for Shaq. It was a testament to the enduring power of integrity, the refusal to accept injustice, and the quiet, relentless courage of those who dared to stand against the tide. Inside, the rooms were filled with makeshift desks, stacks of files, and the low hum of conversation. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and determination, and the walls, once bare, now displayed charts, diagrams, and community outreach schedules. Diana moved among the volunteers and visitors, her presence a quiet anchor in the swirling current of change. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing ideas and concerns, always careful to consider the human cost behind each decision. What had started as a personal battle for justice had rippled outward, touching lives far beyond Diana's own. Local clinics, inspired by the transformation of the once corrupt hospital, began adopting universal care models. Physicians and nurses who had once been shackled by bureaucracy found new purpose in delivering care, guided by compassion and equity. Patients, once wary of institutions that seemed designed to exclude them, returned to these clinics, their trust cautiously rekindled. Yet, even amidst this progress, a thread of suspense lingered, a subtle reminder that change was rarely welcomed by those who profited from the status quo. Diana was acutely aware of the quiet resistance still at play, discrete obstacles to permits, funding delays, anonymous complaints filed against the new clinics. It was clear that the forces seeking to undermine the movement hadn't vanished. They had merely adapted, shifting from overt confrontation to shadowy sabotage. Each setback tested her patience, each challenge a reminder that courage was not a singular act, but a continuous choice. Shaq's continued involvement lent the initiative a public gravitas that kept the media's attention firmly fixed on the unfolding story. His presence at community meetings and public forums drew crowds and cameras alike, his words amplifying the message that healthcare could and should serve everyone with dignity. But even as he stood at the podium, delivering impassioned speeches, he deferred to Diana's quiet leadership. He understood that while his fame opened doors, it was Diana's integrity and unwavering resolve that sustained the momentum. At home, in rare moments of solitude, Diana often found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She thought of the mountains where she had first encountered Shaq, of the quiet, decisive moments that had set this chain of events into motion. She remembered the fear that had gripped her when the hospital's retaliation had threatened to silence her, and the loneliness that had weighed on her before the community's support had materialized. Now the same community that had once seemed distant was her strength, a living testament to the power of solidarity. Children played in the streets again, their laughter mingling with the distant hum of construction, as new clinic buildings rose from once vacant lots. Elderly neighbors, who had once kept to themselves, now lingered on porches, chatting about the changes with cautious optimism. The ripple effect of courage was tangible, woven into the fabric of daily life. Even the local news outlets, once dismissive of the scandal, now ran stories highlighting acts of kindness and progress, sparked by Diana's stand. Despite this, Diana remained vigilant. She knew that courage was not the absence of fear, but the decision to act in spite of it. She maintained meticulous records, anticipating challenges from those who might seek to discredit the new clinics or disrupt their operations. She trained volunteers to recognize subtle signs of interference, encouraged community members to document and report any suspicious activity. The battle was no longer just hers or Shaq's. It belonged to everyone who had suffered under a system that prioritized profit over humanity. As the movement's momentum grew, Diana's home became a symbol of what could be achieved when individuals refused to be silenced. It was a place where old hierarchies crumbled and new, more equitable structures took root. Yet she never allowed herself to forget that real change required constant vigilance, that each victory, however significant, was a step on a longer, more arduous journey. On a cool evening, as the sky blushed with the colors of sunset, Diana stood on her porch, watching the activity that swirled around her. She felt the weight of the past, of betrayals and losses, of whispered threats and public confrontations, but also the lift of resilience and hope. Shaq joined her, his silhouette tall and steady against the fading light. He said nothing, understanding that some moments required only quiet acknowledgement. Together they watched as volunteers carried boxes into a repurposed building down the street, as neighbors gathered to discuss the next phase of the initiative, as the pulse of a community reborn thrummed in the air. Diana knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that unseen forces would continue to resist, but she also knew that they had ignited something enduring. The house behind her was no longer just a home. It was a fortress of courage, a beacon of what could be built from the ashes of injustice. It was a reminder that even in the face of persistent opposition, integrity and resolve could transform not just a neighborhood, but a community, a city, a nation. Diana stood alone in the quiet of early morning, the first light stretching long shadows across the worn sidewalk outside her home. The air was crisp, carrying with it the scent of dew and a hint of possibility. She gazed toward the horizon, where the sunrise painted the sky in delicate hues of gold and pink, a canvas of renewal that matched the cautious hope within her. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she allowed herself to exhale, to feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had not just survived the storm, but had emerged stronger, clearer in purpose. A letter, left anonymously in her mailbox, sat in her hand. The handwriting was familiar now, careful, precise, but this time the words revealed more than coded warnings or veiled hints. It was a confession, a quiet surrender of secrets once held in shadows. The whistleblower's full identity was laid bare, the child of the very hospital CEO who had orchestrated much of the corruption Diana had fought against. The letter spoke of guilt, of a desperate need to make amends, of a silent decision made long ago that culminated in the leak of the incriminating documents. The writer expressed admiration for Diana's courage, for her refusal to be silenced, and concluded with a simple promise. They were now working within the system to rebuild it from the inside, guided by her example. Reading those words, Diana felt a profound stillness settle over her. The weight of betrayal and secrecy, of veiled threats and shadowy resistance, lifted just enough to let light seep in. The knowledge that someone had chosen integrity, even from within the walls of power, was a testament to the ripple effect of her own choices. She folded the letter carefully, placing it in a small wooden box on her desk, alongside other mementos of this long journey: news clippings, photographs from rallies, patient letters filled with gratitude. Later that day, as the sun climbed higher, the community gathered for a modest celebration. It wasn't the spectacle of press conferences or televised speeches, but a genuine expression of gratitude and solidarity. Neighbors brought homemade dishes, children played under the fluttering banners of the new clinics, and a quiet hum of conversation filled the air. The once shuttered hospital now stood transformed, its walls bearing colorful murals painted by local artists, its waiting rooms filled not with anxiety but with hope. Shaq arrived quietly, without fanfare or entourage. He wore a simple jacket and jeans, blending into the crowd, his presence marked not by celebrity, but by friendship. He greeted volunteers warmly, his laughter mingling with theirs, his towering frame a familiar, comforting sight. When he found Diana, she was standing near a table covered in papers and plans for the next phase of the initiative. He approached with a quiet nod, his eyes reflecting the same determination that had carried them through the battle. They didn't need words. Their shared journey spoke for itself. Together they looked out over the gathering, the rising hum of community voices, weaving a tapestry of resilience and possibility. They saw the faces of those who had once felt powerless, now stepping into roles of leadership. Patients turned advocates, nurses turned reformers, children running with the careless freedom of those no longer burdened by fear. The celebration was punctuated by quiet moments of reflection. Elders sharing stories of past struggles, young organizers outlining plans for expanding the model to other cities. Suspense lingered, a quiet acknowledgement that the forces of resistance had not vanished, only retreated into more covert forms. There were rumors of legal appeals, whispers of financial obstacles designed to slow progress, hints of corporate backroom deals attempting to regain control. But the gathering was also a declaration that such tactics would no longer find fertile ground. The seeds of change had taken root, watered by courage and community. As twilight descended, strings of lights flickered on, casting a warm glow over the scene. Diana and Shaq stood side by side, watching as families lingered, reluctant to leave. The quiet hum of conversation was punctuated by bursts of laughter, the kind that comes not from fleeting joy, but from the deep, enduring satisfaction of shared purpose. A sense of something larger loomed at the edges of the evening, not just a local victory, but the first murmurings of a broader movement. Whispers of a nationwide healthcare revolution were beginning to circulate. Other communities, inspired by Diana's story and the transformation of the once corrupt hospital, were exploring similar models of care. Medical professionals reached out from distant cities, asking how they could replicate the initiative. Advocacy groups began organizing conferences, planning campaigns that emphasized universal access, transparency, and patient dignity. The system's cracks were no longer hidden. They were illuminated by the steady light of resistance, and through them, the possibility of true reform was emerging. Diana felt a quiet thrill of anticipation as she listened to the murmurs around her, as she caught snippets of conversations filled with plans and promises. The road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but for the first time the balance of power seemed to be shifting. No longer was the narrative dictated solely by those who wielded it from positions of authority. It was being shaped by the voices of those who had been silenced for too long, now rising in unison to demand a new, just future. As the stars blinked into view above, Diana turned to Shaq, her voice low but resolute. "This is just the beginning," she said. He nodded, a quiet smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Together they stood at the heart of a revolution not yet fully realized, but already unstoppable. They had not merely survived injustice. They had transformed it into a promise of something better. The night settled around them, filled with the low murmur of community voices, the warmth of shared hope, and the quiet certainty that, no matter the obstacles ahead, they would not face them alone. "Your voice matters." Joined the rising chorus demanding justice and dignity. in healthcare. Share this story, spark the conversation, and become part of the movement that's already rewriting the rules. Together, we're not just watching history, we're making it.